Okay, so I'm going to give my talk here. I'm hopefully not going to resist the temptation to wander off into stories, which I'm prone to do, but I'll try and keep it tight, okay? But I will start out from a personal perspective because it is this book and the book that came from this this conference that was originally held in 1967 was really a huge influence on my life. I was able to be in San Francisco for a short time in 1967, the so-called Summer of Love. My brother was already in Berkeley at that time, so we had a place to go, and my friend Robert here and I went out to Berkeley in the summer of 1967. We had no idea, no inkling at that time of this conference, that had taken place previously in San Francisco. We were there to get into the counterculture, and we were kind of bored teenagers in this small Colorado town, quite obsessed with psychedelics, quite obsessed with what was going on, but no real access to it, So these are my friends. This is one of the oldest photographs I have, actually. I don't have any pictures of myself from that day, but we spent a lot of time singing protest songs and wishing we were somewhere else, although Paonia, Colorado was actually a pretty nice town, but it wasn't where we wanted to be at age 18. So sometime in 1968, the book, the first volume, Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, fell into my hands, and it was really a life-changing event for me. This is where I was hoping to be, but that's not where I was at the time. I was stuck in Paonia, Colorado, drinking beer with my friends and occasionally smoking a little weed when we could get a hold of it, which wasn't often. So somewhere in that time frame in my sort of personal and professional career, these two books showed up, and they were very influential. The one on the right there, the first edition of the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. Somehow I got a shabby copy from somewhere, and it's lived on my bookshelf ever since. And the one on the left, the first edition of the Teachings of Don Juan, which my brother gave to me for my 18th birthday. And these two books were important in the sense that one set a context for me, the fact that there was an ethnographic and historical context to the use of these psychedelic medicines. So, and of course, much of what Carlos Castaneda has written has been discredited, or much of it was made up. But it didn't really matter, because the point is that he pointed out that there was an ethnography, there was a cultural tradition for these things, whether or not what he was talking about was accurate or not. And the other book that came out of this symposium provided the other side of that coin. Not only is there ethnography, there was science, there was a great deal of ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology that was being done at that time. Schultes, R.E. Schultes from Harvard, was probably the leading instigator of this first conference. But as soon as I got hold of this book, I read it from cover to cover. And that excited me because I could see perhaps a future for myself working in the field of ethnopharmacology. So it was very influential for me at the time, and led to a number of adventures and misadventures. Flash forward to 1971 when my brother and myself and some similarly passionate compadres, which we loosely called the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, found ourselves on the way to the Amazon in search of an exotic hallucinogen, an orally active form of dimethyltryptamine derived from Varroa species, which were widely used as snuffs in the area, but the orally active preparation was quite rare and quite uninvestigated. Well, we were looking for an orally active form of DMT because DMT, those of you who know its phenomenology know it's quite short. It's hard to bring much back from that other than a sense of astonishment. So we thought maybe if we could find an orally active form, it would last longer. So we went in search of this Varola preparation, and we didn't find it. But what we did find instead was this, the Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. And when we went to La Chorrera in the Colombian Amazonas in search of this Witoto preparation, that proved hard to find. But at La Chorrera, these mushrooms proved quite abundant. And this is, in some way, the perfect orally active form of DMT. As you know, the chemists among you know, it's very, very close chemically to DMT. And that trivial chemical difference is just enough to make it orally active. So you can read my book or Terence's and find out to put it mildly, we quickly got in over our heads. But we came out, and one thing we did, we brought spores back from La Chorrera. We at least had the presence of mind to do that, and after several years of working on that, we figured out how to grow mushrooms. And a very simple technique that any 7th grade science student could pretty much do in their basement. And I'm sure there were many parents and many basements. What is Johnny doing in the basement? Oh, he's taken an interest in growing mushrooms. Isn't that wonderful? and so we, in a sense, made this technology available to the world and kind of unleashed the mushroom on the world, for better or worse. 45 years later, I kind of hope it's for the better, because now psilocybin is emerging as a very important psychedelic medicine for all sorts of therapeutic uses, and it's a remarkable substance, even though it's only been known since 1958, when Albert Hofmann originally isolated it. What we were looking for when we went to La Chorrera, I did not find then, but 10 years later, I returned to the Amazon, to Peru this time, as a graduate student, at the University of British Columbia. And I went this time to an area called the Rio Ampiacu, a day and a half river ride downriver from Iquitos, Peru. And the Rio Ampiacu is the area that was sort of the second home of the Witotos and the Boras, which were the two tribes that had this orally active Varola preparation, which they called Ukuhe. We went to La Chorrera the first time. That was their ancestral home, but those folks had been forcibly relocated south of the Putumayo in the early part of this century as a result of the rubber boom and the atrocities that were committed around that. So this time, we went to the Rio Ampiacu near the town of Pebas on the Amazon. And the Rio Ampiacu happens to mean river of poisons. Ampi is the name for a particularly potent kind of arrow poison that the Witotos were famous for. And so we ended up in this place in 1981, and the Institute for Ecotechnics, of which Deborah Snyder is here, she's affiliated with them, helped us get there, supported the logistics and so on. And when we got there, we found that the kumalas, the Varola trees from which this medicine is derived, were quite abundant. What was lost was the knowledge, and the knowledge was rare. We found a few informants who were willing to help us. They sort of remembered what their grandfathers knew, but to them, it was a dying knowledge. It was always more or less a covert knowledge known to shamans, but they were willing to help us try to reconstruct that. And one of our best informants here was this gentleman here, Don Marcos. His father had been a shaman in his tribe, and he had used ukuhe So Don Marcos gamely prepared it for us, and as part of the field work, of course, you have to conduct large animal bioassays. And so we did. We obtained about 7 or 8 of these different samples from different sources, tested them all. Some were not active at all. This particular one was quite active, but compared to the psilocybe mushrooms was not so interesting. But it definitely demonstrated that it was an orally active form of DMT, and the mechanisms of that were not so clear. So that's what it looked like, the final product, resembling various things. And you had to eat maybe a third of this to get any effect. And it wasn't very pleasant, but it was active. And the second part of my thesis work was on ayahuasca. And my dissertation work was kind of a comparison between the botany and chemistry and pharmacology of ayahuasca, also an orally active form of DMT in a certain sense, and this ukuhe, this much less well-known medicine. Well, now everyone knows what ayahuasca is, or anyone in our circles. Certainly everyone has heard of ayahuasca. Many people have never heard of the Varroa preparation, and it's kind of dying knowledge. But this was Don Fidel Mosambite, my first informant on ayahuasca in Pucallpa. Wonderful man. He was the real deal, a true curandero, and a true scientist in the sense that he was able to share his secrets. He, when I stumbled into his courtyard, barely speaking Spanish and obviously clueless, he could assess the situation very, very quickly and, oh, you're here for that, okay. And so over the course of a couple of months, we hung out with him. He made a number of different preparations of ayahuasca and let us try it and take samples back to the laboratory to analyze. So he was, a revered healer and a really good man and very kind to us, us being myself and my fellow also clueless graduate student, Don McCrae, who was traveling with me. And finally got all this stuff back to the laboratory at UBC and started tearing it apart and doing chemical analysis and some pharmacological assays and so on. Took another 3 years to do that. And then, like all good theses should result in, eventually we got a couple papers out of it. So these were 2 papers, the first 2 papers that were published out of my thesis. And again, the ayahuasca got a lot of attention, and the paper on the Varroa preparations was, sort of lost to obscurity. It's still out there, but nobody read it. But as a result of that publication of those papers, my life took another kind of turn. I should mention also that at this time, my colleague, Luis Eduardo Luna, who's there in the back and who's giving the next talk, was also sort of rattling around Iquitos, and he had come to Iquitos at about the same time, only a few months after we'd met, in Vancouver actually, to do his thesis work on curanderismo or vegetalismo, and he connected with Don Emilio Andrade, among other informants, but Don Emilio was his main informant for many, many years. And I met Don Emilio a couple of times, and another, a truly wise and kind healer. And Eduardo studied with him for a long time, ended up making a movie with another colleague called Don Emilio and His Little Doctors, or I guess Don Emilio y sus doctorcitos sounds better in Spanish. You can watch that on YouTube. It's still there, and there have been a lot of movies made about ayahuasca since then, but in my opinion, it's still one of the best. The production values are terrible. The content is invaluable because basically it's Don Emilio telling his story to the camera, and there's very little narration beyond that. So if you have a spare minute, go look at that movie. It's rather excellent. So after I got my thesis done, I put out those papers, and in those days, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have PDFs. You publish your papers, and if anybody was interested in your work, people would send little postcards and request, a reprint. So eventually, I got a request for a reprint from this man here, Juan M. Saavedra, who is an investigator at the National Institute of Mental Health, Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology. And at the time, I didn't realize that he actually had known my supervisor, and he had known Schultes because he was on an expedition in 1979 to the Amazon that was sponsored by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And they took their fancy research vessel there, equipped with laboratories and all that, up the Amazon. And Juan had been one of the investigators on that. So I was surprised when I got the reprint request because I recognized his name. He was also famous because he was one of the first people to investigate the endogenous synthesis of DMT. Previously, he'd worked with Julie Axelrod, who eventually won the Nobel Prize for his work on neurotransmission. But Juan Saavedra and Julius Axelrod had worked together to show that, yes, indeed, DMT is synthesized in the body, and they could trace, that pathway and detect it in the lungs and other tissues. That was what excited me about Dr. Saavedra's work and what I was hoping to work on when I went there. I ended up working on something completely different. It was nonetheless rewarding. But after I had been to his laboratory, just a couple of weeks, I just moved out from California, and I was getting set up in his lab, and he took me into the lab, and he says, there's an old box of chemicals up there on the shelf that Julie and I had synthesized when we were doing, custom synthesized when we were doing our work. You should go through that box, see if there's anything useful, and, take it and throw the rest away, So I stood on this bench, got up behind the top shelf of the storage cabinet. The bench, by the way, where serotonin was discovered and characterized. I mean, working in this lab was kind of amazing because, the ghosts of the great people in serotonin pharmacology are looking over your shoulders. But I got up there and I found this dusty old box, and it did indeed have a few interesting compounds, a whole bunch of tryptamine derivatives that they'd had made. Those, we won't say what happened to those. I actually saved them for many years. I was afraid to bioassay them because they had some pretty strange structures. But the other thing sitting right beside that box that was interesting for me was a copy of the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And this one was in mint condition. It had obviously never been touched, never even been opened. So it kind of disappeared and disappeared to my bookshelf. But I took it as a sign, in a sense, about the influence of this book. And so that, that was just significant, sort of. And so that's what sent me on this path, and many others as well. And here we are today, continuing to plug away. Why do we bother looking for psychoactive drugs, or in what you might call the ethnopharmacopoeia? Well, it's, I think, obvious to people in this room why that's a worthwhile thing. It's not about just finding more and more interesting and diverse ways to get high, although that's part of it, but the discovery of these new psychoactive substances, whether natural or synthetic, is very important because novel compounds, structurally novel compounds, are probes for novel pharmacological mechanisms, and they often suggest new mechanisms, new cellular and molecular targets. And this can enhance our understanding of the neurochemical foundations of consciousness. the neuropathology of mental illness and potential therapeutic applications, and overall a better understanding of the mind. These things are molecular probes for all that. So it's worth going after it, and despite what many people may think, there's probably more work left to be done than actually has been done. So what I want to do with the rest of this talk is just give you an overview of some of the kind of outstanding discoveries that have happened in the last 50 years and some of the work that remains to be done. So one of the interesting thing is harmine and the beta-carbolines. Harmine is a hoary old alkaloid in the sense it was discovered in Paganum harmala long before ayahuasca was even on the radar. It was discovered and characterized in Paganum harmala around 1841. And so it's one of these historically classical alkaloids. And we think of it as the MAO inhibitor that activates ayahuasca, which it certainly is. It turns out it has a whole lot of other properties which people are beginning to pay attention to now. A variety of receptor interactions, different types of pharmacological activity, and so on. So there's a refocus of attention on simply harming. So I guess this is a lesson that even what we think we know, we only know a part of. We only know a fraction of, and the chemistry of ayahuasca still has a lot to teach us, even though it's been worked out pretty thoroughly. Other actions of harmine, it intercalates with DNA. It can be photoactivated to form covalent adducts with DNA by inserting between the base pairs. So it has that property, and as a result, it has anti-tumor action. It has anti-parasitic activity. And it's just interesting. A whole new mechanism, a whole new world is opening up around harmine. Exciting discoveries that it modulates neurogenesis in the hippocampus may be important in the prevention of Alzheimer's and that sort of thing. So lots of work to be done. Another area that was not on the radar at all in 1967 are the what you might call the ethnopharmacopoeia of admixture plants that surrounds ayahuasca. Sometimes these are put with the brew, sometimes they're used in the dietas that are associated with apprenticeships and learning how to use it. And Eduardo and I, after my thesis, we wrote an extensive review paper on these admixture plants. Again, which got practically no attention. It was originally published in Spanish in America Indígena, and then in the mid-90s it was published in English in a compendium that Schultes had edited called Ethnobotany, Evolution of a Discipline. And we looked at the ethnography a little bit of these plants and also the chemistry. Interestingly enough, most of the plants, we looked at about 53 genera that were used in detail. And as you can see, the bigger portion of them are completely uninvestigated. So of those, various ones kind of stood out. All of these were genera that were used associated with this ayahuasca admixture complex. And all of these that are listed there were purportedly used for many purposes because, as you know, plants in the traditional context are used for many things. All of these were rumored to be hallucinogens in themselves or psychedelics in themselves. Many of them had unknown constituents. Fair proportion of them had indole alkaloids. So here is another generation of graduate students or postdocs could spend a lot of time sorting all this out. And there's been very little work. We represented this at Psychedelic Science 2013, thinking there would be a whole compendium of new data to talk about. Virtually no work had been done since the mid-1980s when we first published this. So again, a lot of work. And these plants are also, they're just the pharmacopoeia of traditional medicine. Often have these purposes. You can go to any marketplace in Iquitos, go to the herbalist stall, and you can buy many of these plants in the form of tinctures, and this is the basis of Amazonian ethnomedicine. With respect to psychoactivity, there were many that were interesting. This one's particularly interesting. It's called Toé negro. It's in the Acanthaceae, Teleostachya lanceolata. Rumor has it that if you brew a tea of about 7 leaves of this plant, it's very abundant around Iquitos. It's a little ground cover. But if you brew up a tea and take it, you have a 3-day experience in which you have a conversation with the plant. And minor side effects, sometimes it makes you lose your sight for 2 or 3 days. Totally chemically uncharacterized, and I think there's some interesting chemistry here. Another one is Mimosa hostilis, which of course Manuel will be talking about, the source of Yarima in eastern Brazil, also an orally active DMT preparation, but the mystery is that there is no MAO inhibitor. There's no admixture in Yarima to activate it orally. So it's not clear why it works. But part of the clue may be this molecule, urimamine, recently isolated from it. And it may be an MAO inhibitor, or it may actually be a hallucinogen in itself, a psychedelic in itself. It has not been bioassayed as far as I know, but it's an interesting compound. Mimosa hostilis, as many of you may know, is very, very high in DMT in the roots and sometimes used as an alternative to the traditional admixture plants. Urimamine's there in about the same abundance as DMT in the roots. Another interesting area, again, completely off the radar as far as the early conference, are the acacia species, which Snu Vogelbrinder is going to tell us about. There are about 1,200 species of acacia in the world. It's a very large genus. Probably 75% or more contain tryptamines of various kinds. And they are the most potent known sources of DMT. Some acacias have 2% DMT in the roots. Most of them are native to Australia. They're called generically, they're wattles. And there's no evidence of indigenous use of these acacias in Australia, although there are suggestions that that may have happened. And ironically, wattle is the national tree of Australia, and Australia has recently declared all wattles illegal. Right, so they have honored their national tree by banning it. And this is a particularly rare species of acacia that grows endemically at Buffalo National Park in Australia. And if you go to DMT Nexus website, you can get a nice long list of all the tryptamine-containing acacias. And there are many, many. Another interesting thing are the toads. The toad chemistry is now attracting attention. I do not know, honestly, how strong the evidence for a traditional historical use of toad venom as psychedelic is. I think it's pretty loose, but the toads are now attracting a lot of attention, and people are using toad venom in therapy, particularly from Bufo alvarius, the species that contains 5-methoxy-DMT as opposed to bufotenin. And certainly in the iconography of the Olmec and other groups, they were preoccupied with toads. They were aware, they were using it for something, but it's not clear whether it was food or what exactly. This is Salvia divinorum. This will be familiar to many of you, and in a way, this is one of the major breakthroughs in ethnopharmacology in the last 50 years, because this really has some remarkable properties. It's the Mexican mint, the psychotropic Mexican mint used in Mazatec shamanism. Finally, isolated a very interesting molecule from it called salvinorin A. Unusual in that it doesn't contain nitrogen. Most psychotropics do contain nitrogen. This isn't an alkaloid. And it is actually the most potent psychoactive substance so far isolated in nature, including it's at the level of potency of LSD. About 50 micrograms is a psychotropic dose of this material. Also remarkable is it's an extremely selective kappa opiate agonist. That's what's shown here. In the back shows at the on the axis there it shows different receptors. The red blocks in front are LSD. That shows that LSD is really not, it's selecting mostly for serotonin receptors, but it hits a broad spectrum of receptors. Salvinorin A hits only one receptor, the kappa opiate receptor. Brian Roth, who is the chemist that figured all of this out, figured out the pharmacology of salvinorin A, remarked to me, he said, if I had tried to design a drug selective for the kappa opiate receptor, it couldn't have been as good as this one. This is really remarkable because there's nothing in the structure that would lead you to think that it would have this activity. Dr. Roth said, the stuff looks like cholesterol. Who would imagine? But there it is. And he's gone on to do a lot more work on this, making analogs. And it may have some therapeutic activity. Other things that are kind of on the radar in the original conference, like kava kava was discussed. Also, the hypermethysticum used in Polynesia as a social lubricant has some very interesting properties. It's traditionally used throughout Polynesia. And it contains, again, non-nitrogenous compounds called kavalactones, 6 major kavalactones. And these have sedative and anxiolytic properties, also muscle relaxing properties, a variety of the neuroprotection, analgesic, and kava kava has never really been developed as a prescription drug, although there's been some interesting work done on its protection against damage from smoking, which I didn't include here, but that's recently emerged. So many of these so-called ethnobotanicals, ethnopsychobotanicals, find their way into the market as dietary supplements, because under the regulatory framework that we have, that's the way they get there. So you can buy kava extracts in health food stores, and it's quite a useful drug. Another important one, not reported on at all in 1967, was iboga, and it's used traditionally among the Bwiti tribe in initiation ceremonies, and it produces a 12 to 36-hour trance in which the initiate is given the wisdom of the ancestors. It contains a variety of indole alkaloids, the primary one being ibogaine itself, and related compounds. And it works on a variety of receptors, so it's not specifically a psychedelic, although it has psychedelic properties. And, of course, in therapeutic arena, it's emerged as a very promising treatment for addictions, specifically for opiate addiction, though it may be good for other things as well. Dr. Ken Alper is here, probably the world's expert on iboga and ibogaine, and he's going to explain all this to us in more detail. And then another one that was kind of definitely not on the radar at that time is kratom, Metrogyna speciosa, member of the Rubiaceae, the coffee family from Southeast Asia. It has alkaloids, and it's used like opium in Southeast Asia and sometimes as a substitute for opium in Southeast Asia. And in the context of folk medicine, it's often used to help people who are dependent on opium or even heroin get off those drugs and get onto something a little less harmful, and then they can taper off that. It's also just used, in its own right. And it has a very interesting pharmacology. It has alkaloids that hit mostly the mu opiate receptors. Some of these are quite potent, even more so than morphine, which is kind of the standard. And it does not cause respiratory depression. So that's very interesting for an opiate. It's less toxic from that angle. And it's been suggested that it might be used to help people get off opiates. But of course, the DEA, never one to want to allow that to happen, has been evaluating it, whether it should be banned, whether it should be illegalized. And a coterie, a certain number of scientists, one of whom is Dr. Christopher McCurdy, who is here and is going to talk to us about kratom, have said, hold your horses. These compounds have uses, and they're part of the solution. They are not part of the opioid epidemic problem. And so kratom is kind of in a legal limbo at the moment, but not, strictly speaking, illegal. Another very interesting plant from South Africa, Scaledium tortuosum, which is called Kana or Heogud. I can't really pronounce it. It's used as a traditional medicine among the San people. The roots are chewed, or tea, I understand, can even be smoked or snuffed. And it's used basically as a mood elevator, an anxiolytic, a sedative, and a euphoriant. It's also used as an appetite suppressant. It contains interesting alkaloids that are potent serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And it also inhibits phosphodiesterase. So it has a lot of promise, and actually has been developed as a dietary supplement in Canada, as a natural health product called Zembrin that you can take essentially as an anxiolytic and possibly as a cognition enhancer. And Dr. Nigel Garrick, who is here, has really led the charge on the investigation of this, another promising ethnobotanical. And then also the frogs again, or actually in this case maybe the toads. We talked about these bufo species that contain tryptamines, but now Cambo, which is Philomedusa, one of the tree arrow poison or tree frogs, is getting attention actually as a tourist recreation in kind of way. People go there, you take the venom of this frog, which you have to torture it to get the venom, and then you collect the venom, burn your skin with a cigarette, and then rub this venom into it, and you have a very, very rapid, dramatic, and probably quite dangerous reaction involving precipitous lowering of blood pressure and so on. It's used in hunting medicine because after you get through all that, then they say you feel great for a few days, and you can go running full tilt through the forest barefoot looking for game. Tourists are going down to try this Sapo or Cambo medicine, they sometimes call it. I go to South America quite a lot. I won't be one of those tourists because, frankly, I think this is maybe, well, certainly a guy with a 65-year-old heart should not be taking this, so I won't be taking it. Some people think it's really interesting, and I think pharmacologically it's got a lot of promise. So that's kind of the last 50 years of work, many things still waiting to be investigated, but there's a lot of work to sort all this out, and these are all things that have come to the surface in the last 50 years. Well, what's ahead for the next 50 years? I'm not going to go too far. I'm almost done. But I wanted to mention a couple of things that are kind of major interesting areas. Boletus is a kind of edible mushroom. They're quite widespread. They're all over the world. They're the ones that have the pores instead of gills in the cap. And there are persistent rumors that there are psychoactive Boletus, at least a few species, but it's been hard to nail down. Boletus manicus has been reported to be used in Papua New Guinea as in a cultural context called mushroom madness, where people will consume this mushroom for about a week, certain seasons of the year, and then everybody goes bananas, and it has manic behavior. But it may just be a cultural institution, like going amok, with another cultural institution that doesn't involve drugs, where they consume the mushroom and then that gives them leave to act crazy in a culturally sanctioned manner. But there's no psychoactive substance in Boletus manicus, perhaps, or perhaps it's only there in certain strains or at certain times of the year. Because now rumors have emerged from China where Boletus and this one particularly are called, I'm butchering the pronunciation, Josh, forgive me, but they're called Jiao Ren Ren or something like that, and it means little person. And it seems that these are edible Boletus, but when people go to the marketplace or when people don't cook the Boletus quite enough, sometimes they get this effect. So it's an ephemeral effect. It's not every time. And the effect is very interesting because it causes hallucinations in which the little people come out. They see diminutive little people, or sometimes little animals, or sometimes insects, but very, very tiny. And the Chinese don't have the same mindset toward psychedelics and all this that we do, but they all seem to regard this with a great deal of amusement. They think this is just fun. But they don't seek the experience, but when it happens, they approach it with a sense of humor. And one of our guests here, Josh Wickerham, has been to China and evaluated this in the field, basically by eating every kind of Boletus he could get his hands on. And he had a number of stomach aches, but no psychotropic effects. So this is an ongoing project, very interesting. Also fish, there are a number of psychotropic fish that have been reported, many different kinds. And again, this seems to be something that it's not consistently psychotropic. It may be a seasonal thing, it may be the fish contains another organism like an algae or a bacteria. But the so-called dream fish of Hawaii, when people do encounter it and it's active, it produces a prolonged sort of dreamlike state. One National Geographic photographer described his experience as pure science fiction. So again, this is another area that has just not been investigated at all. Insects are another possibility, a possible source of new psychoactive agents. There are, again, rumors. Considering the close chemical interactions between insects and plants, and the fact that insects sequester compounds from plants and use them for protection or whatever, it's surprising there's not more information on this. But really, there's this interesting report over 100 years in which this French explorer, Saint-Hilaire, traveled in Brazil in the 19th century, and he reported that the larva of this moth, which feeds on the bamboo, was consumed by the Malilas Indians, a tribe native to the Brazilian province of Minas Gerais. When the intestinal parts are eaten, it induces fantastic dreams lasting more than a day. There's been no contemporary confirmation of this report. There have been no chemical investigations. So this is also a whole area of potential ethnopsychopharmacology as working through the insect biome, because the molecular complexity, and you find the insects is, at least as great as in the plants. Another area that hasn't been closely looked at all are the fungal endophytes, which are quite widespread in plants. And in the Amazon, the sedges, the Cyperus species, which are called piri-piri, they have a variety of applications, including obstetrics, but also used as hallucinogens. And many of the endophytes in piri-piri and other grasses, like this one from China, Achnatharum inebrium, called drunken horse grass, contains ergolines, contains lysergic acid derivatives. And many endophytes do, and they contain other alkaloids. So this is another area of sort of unexplored molecular diversity. These endophytes, I think they're promising areas for discovering a lot of highly bioactive molecules, not only psychotropic molecules. And then I wanted to mention Garden of Eden. This was written by our friend Snu Vogelbrinder, who's here, who's going to talk to us about tryptamine-containing acacias. But this book is a labor of love. It's out of print in hard copy, but I understand a PDF is available there. And it really is a labor of love. He spent many years compiling data from a variety of sources on everything, literally everything that might have any kind of psychotropic activity. So some of the organisms he talked about you wouldn't expect, even bacteria, lichens, algae, this kind of thing. So this is a wonderful book. I think it's a major contribution. And again, this is years of future work to sort that through. So in 2006, I managed to go back to where I was in 1981 when I was collecting ukuhe to the town of Pebas. I went to this town of Pucurquillo on the Rio Ampayacu, the river of poisons, because I had a grant to do some collecting in that area. And some of our compadres, you can see, were going native. We managed to get out of there before it got too bad. But one of our companions, the young woman there, is Sarah Hutt, and she'll be here tomorrow night. She's working on this wonderful short documentary called In Search of It. I think it's called now The Scientist and the Shaman, and we're going to show that tomorrow night before we show the longer film. So that was a chance to get back to this area that I first went in 1981, and that was the River of Poisons, and that is sunset on Rio Ampayacu. So thank you.